Domain Advisor for Digital Transformation at Optiv, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. First, thank you all for joining. Today, we're going to be discussing how Secure Access Service Edge, or SASE, has become an overused marketing term with vendors focusing on definitions that emphasize on their particular strengths, and at its core, what SASE is and its benefits. Our experts will be sharing insights into the core concepts and benefits of SASE, including the improved remote user experience, enhanced security with zero trust, flexibility and scalability in the cloud, and simplified network and tech management. Speaking of our experts, joining me in the discussions today are Christopher Dexter, our domain security architect, and Paul Herman, our technical manager. Thank you both for joining us today. Starting with our first discussion topic, living in a post-COVID world and the cloud adoption keeping momentum, how does SASE redefine the traditional approach to network and security convergence? I'll start with you, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Troy, and thanks for having me here today. I think we continuously hear SASE, right? It's the buzzword. We think, as we look at vendors and how they market versus kind of the true architecture, we look at traditional firewalls and networking capabilities. They love to go with that with their marketing scheme, right? Hey, let's implement a firewall, CASB, SWIG. You think of, legacy, Symantec, Blueco, always pushing season SWIG. Now we see this true convergence of like a Netscope and a Zscaler starting to push more of, hey, how do we combine networking and security to really have that defense in depth? And we're seeing it be pushed more with SD-WAN capabilities, kind of replacing some of your legacy firewall capabilities. And we start to see it more turn into a strategy and truly architecting your environment appropriately from that SASE perspective, as opposed to, hey, well, kind of, I don't want to speak bad, but let it sit and forget about it sometimes, right? It has a shelf life, it depreciates, things like that, where now you have a truly a cloud-based platform and a cloud delivered service to now truly architect how we're going to truly implement this appropriately so it has low impact on our end users and it fits within our networking architecture.
Paul, I'll ask you kind of the same question. How does SASE redefine the traditional approach for networking security from your side?
Yeah, I think, the biggest difference that we're seeing, kind of touching on some of the things that Chris touched on, is, these are not just bolt-on services. Like, we didn't just start with this security services edge and they just bolted on and added on, different functionality where you have to do additional deployment. These are all truly cloud native delivered services where they're all, packaged in as microservices within infrastructure that these companies are building and developing and scaling themselves. So instead of having to go deploy, more processing power, more compute, and more things on-prem or even in your own IaaS, you're able to leverage their cloud in these scenarios to be able to adopt that different functionality. And, it really becomes a licensing conversation on, like, how do we get to that mature state for all of our SASE capabilities. And I think we'll talk about this throughout this webinar is, where do you start? Because when you look at SASE, there is so much underneath the covers and, it's a little overwhelming and everyone just sees like it as like an easy button. And there's so much more to it because, even inside of your security stack on that SASE side versus the network stack, I mean, there is so much more from a maturity perspective that you can really cover there. And it's real, right? Like, you're able to have those native functionalities and those microservices baked right into your platform. And, as long as you're able to get your traffic to the location that it needs to be, you're able to provide that defense in depth and more holistic controls, regardless where your users are at. And I think that's, a really a big key to this architecture is you don't have to, hairpin everybody back on-prem. You're able to do cloud native and as low latency as possible type of connections.
And you mentioned secure service edge or SSE. That's obviously another element when we start talking about buzzword bingo of are you focused on SASE? Yep. Are we focused on SSE? Let's talk about capabilities and requirements, not just buzzwords. Moving on to our second question here. With user adoption becoming a primary concern with SASE related projects, what are the key benefits of implementing SASE for remote user experiences? Go ahead and start with you on this one, Paul.
Yeah, I think, especially when you're talking about VPN replacement type technologies, when we're talking about that hairpin where you have a VPN concentrator on-prem, you're routing all of your users' traffic back on-prem just to hairpin it outbound to different data centers across your environment, or other cloud delivered services, whether, you have different requirements to be able to do so. Where SASE comes into place, you're able to really leverage that remote user experience to where, instead of doing that hairpin back to your data center, you're able to say, well, hey, I'm a user located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and just because my company's data center is down in Florida, but I have services that are natively able to get access directly with having security controls applied in line while you're able to facilitate that. You don't have to hairpin back through a data center to get those security controls anymore. So you're able to do that low latency user experience for your IaaS, your SaaS services, and then you only send traffic through your data center when you absolutely have to. And I think the big part to this, from a remote user experience perspective, is being able to actually apply context to those policies. So it's not just a concurrent VPN connection that you're maintaining. You're able to say, well, hey, Paul needs access to the corporate intranet. He needs access to our SAP service. And these are the 5 things that Paul needs to access based on his user persona. And then you only give access to those things. And on top of that, it's on demand when I need it, right? So we're not just maintaining a network connection that's waiting to see, well, when is Paul going to click on this thing? It's going to say, hey, Paul's trying to access SAP, establish and broker a tunnel to that service, and then allow me to access as long as I meet the context to the policy to be able to access those. So you're able to facilitate that type of experience, but then you can also kind of do more of that maintain type of connection. And from the secure web gateway side, 80 and 443, you're always going to have those web type of controls when you're talking about that user experience too.
Thank you. And Chris, I guess similar question. What benefits do you see for SASE and remote user experience?
Everything that Paul just said, and then it goes to how can my users or my employees work from anywhere, right? You go back to 2020 when COVID was around, and companies had to jump into a solution of, hey, how do I have security controls around a borderless perimeter, right? There's no defined border here. My users need to work remotely. So that's really what kickstarted this. And now it's, well, I still want the flexibility for my users to work remotely. And now being able to not hairpin, like Paul said, and have, you look at some of the bigger players, they have 180 plus data centers around the world. Being able to connect there while still having access and being able to work anywhere is huge. Now you take it a step further, and now you have one console to have those policies in place. So now that I can manage it for remote users, of being able to manage my, SWIG policies, my cloud inline policies, and DLP policies all in one place, instead of having to kind of click the buttons around for legacy tools, makes that 10 times easier in one console. And then you take it a step further. Now it's an identity-based approach, right? You could have legacy. Yes, you had that before on-prem. And if you have a company that has a good IGA solution and user attestation reports, then you're able to allow that access. But now it takes it a step further of putting that user attestation reports into place for access, like Paul was saying, into those applications, whether it's SaaS, IaaS, PaaS, internal applications, and having those users access them literally anywhere in the world.
It's actually a great segue for our next topic too. So, with zero trust being a major driver for most organizations the last few years, in what ways does SASE enhance security through zero trust principles? And how can enterprises effectively adopt these measures?
So I'll segue into what I was just talking about. Sorry, cut you off. It's those principles, right? We speak highly of, SASE doesn't equal zero trust, and zero trust doesn't equal SASE, right? They work well together. SASE or SSE is a player in adopting a zero trust principle or adopting a zero trust strategy. Right? You look at private access replacing VPN, being able to have a one-way tunnel, identity-based users only able to access the applications that they need to have access to. with other users not being able to access that, right? That shift into that zero trust mentality. You can't really get that with a next gen firewall that we've seen before, right? Then you layer it on. Some people are still using SD-WAN capabilities that gets in that layer 3 for VPN replacement to continue that access. And then it's identity based, right? So like I just said, taking that user identity, putting it into a policy, being able to get granular in your inline policies for whether it's a specific user, a user group, an organizational unit, which can be regional based. That's that true getting towards true zero trust, right? Effectively adopting these is having conversations with the experts, right? Plug for Optiv. Having conversations with us to say, hey, this is how you want to adopt it. It's a strategy, right? It's a marathon, not a sprint when it comes to adopting a SASE solution. We want to make sure you're doing it effectively, efficiently, and the least amount of impact to an end user so that business can run as usual. How you do that is being able to approach it in that strategic effect of, hey, this is what we're going to implement first, second, third, having a roadmap appropriately mapped out so that it's meeting your business use cases. It's stakeholders understand it. Your C-suite understands it. Everybody plays a part when you're adopting a SASE solution.
Yeah. Paul, I'd pose the same question to you in terms of,
Sure.
How does zero trust interact and affect, SASE?
Yeah, I think what's been really interesting about it, it's honestly pretty easy to adopt ZTNA. ZTNA does not equal zero trust. These are all deployment and implementation maturity models is what truly gets you to those zero trust principles. Our consulting team, myself included, we can come in and look at, how are you using your VPN solution today and how can we migrate you to ZTNA? We can migrate you to ZTNA and effectively replicate those same exact functionalities that you have with your VPN today. And you can get to a stable state where your company's functioning, but that doesn't equate to adopting actual zero trust principles. The real challenge and also success with SASE is getting to that actual secure state when you're looking at your identity-based policies. You're looking at, what's the context, what are the user groups that Chris was talking about, what is the business unit I belong to, and then actually cataloging to say, okay, I know I'm a HR employee. These are the 10 applications I should be able to access. If I hire a new HR person, we know that they should directly go into this group and their access should be able to be facilitated. Like that's the type of contextual model that you can go into. But, I think where SASE has been able to take it many steps further is, really looking at the specific context to what the user's doing. So a good example is device posture. So, is the device healthy? Like, let's say you have CrowdStrike deployed. Well, your SASE solution is going to be able to see, well, hey, before I grant you access to our private resources, to have that, again, that least privilege type of approach, I'm going to pass you through a couple checks. I'm going to see, do you have the latest OS version that we maintain as compliant for our environment? Do we have the CrowdStrike agent and process running on my machine? Am I joined to directory? Whatever, do I have BitLocker enabled on my devices? You're able to set that context on your policy-driven and identity-based approach to be able to say, should I even let this user in? Doesn't matter that we've validated them as user. Do they also meet the other criteria to require allowing that access? And I think where things have gone those other steps further is, what does your users' behavior look like? So, what we're starting to see adoption is user behavior analytics baked in to say, well, hey, we normally trust Paul as a normal user, but, he just downloaded a ton of stuff from our corporate OneDrive and we consider that risky behavior. So we're going to drop his user score to be able to say, well, he's doing some risky behavior, and maybe you have a policy that says, well, Paul's behavior dropped to this threshold, and now we're not going to let him access some of those corporate resources anymore until he comes back up to an acceptable level. So you're able to do more proactive things just based on the native capabilities that exist inside of these SASE solutions, because you're seeing so much visibility into what users are doing. You're able to proactively prevent potential insider threat exfiltration. And, again, going to that least privileged type of approach, I think there's tremendous benefits to getting there from a maturity model perspective. And then you can always kind of loop through and monitor for those situations to say, well, yeah, yesterday Paul's CrowdStrike was running, but today it's not. So we're going to block access and potentially have a remediation connection to be able to, remediate that and get that agent back running on the machine. So there's a lot of different flexibility there.
Yeah,
I just want to add real quick. Sorry, Troy. I was going to say, just add real quick based on, Paul's talking about a lot of stuff, right? So we always say that SASE at a high level is simple, right? It's a simple concept to understand. When you get into implementation and adopting, it becomes very complex with the different capabilities and what you can do and how granular you can get. And I always advise people to warn their clients that when you adopt a SASE solution, it opens up a door of visibility into your environment, both good and bad. And I've seen it more on the bad end of things of having to change certain, whether it's a DNS server, whether it's identity, whether it's AD configurations for what they're using for their user principal names, things like that are to keep in mind as you're adopting a SASE solution, it can get very complex.
All right, and for my next question, we'll start with you on this one, Paul. Can you share an example of how SASE offers flexibility and scalability in the cloud to meet changing business needs?
Sure. Yeah, I think the main benefit is around allowing security controls for a global workforce, right? Traditionally, again, going back to your legacy type of model for your architecture for enforcing security controls, it doesn't matter if I'm in England or in Texas or in California, I always had hairpin all my traffic to where my applications lived and where, our VPN concentrators were living. And now with these cloud native type solutions like this, you're able to say, well, hey, here's my policy set. We're going to replicate it across every single one of my SASE solutions, points of presence. Those would be their POPs. That would be, the actual microservices for their infrastructure for where policy enforcement takes place. And I don't have to click a button to say, well, hey, we need to go send that out to, the EU, and then we need to send that back to the US. Now, if you have different policy requirements to say, based on you coming from different sources to apply different policy sets, you can always do that. However, you can still replicate your policy set anywhere without having to hairpin them all the way back to the US or where, your security controls would natively live on-prem. And I think, we've been able to see more adoption and more maturity that way with, really focusing on the end user experience, getting clients deployed, whatever that steering mechanism is to get the traffic to your SASE points of presences. And, you can focus more on like, how do I enforce those security controls, make sure we're at an acceptable state. And what I think is what's most interesting about this is since these are all cloud native solutions, there is so much development happening on these platforms. You'll see monthly major releases to where more features are baked on into the platform that's not requiring you to go buy another SKU. You're able to just go in like, oh, looks like they enhanced their DLP capabilities. Now I can do X, Y, and Z with this to be able to help me get to a mature model faster. And maybe it's through automation or exposing their APIs to be able to run runbooks in my SOAR platform to be able to make contextual decisions based on what we're seeing to change policies inside of the SASE platform. So we're seeing a lot of that kind of interoperability and just rapid development cycles to where, things that clients are buying now, they're seeing increased capabilities even within their life cycle of their contract without them having to go back to the pool and get more funds. We're seeing more and more adoption natively as you're going through. So it's been incredible to see.
Yeah, that speed of innovation that the cloud brings is definitely huge. I guess to phrase it to you, Chris, similar question, flexibility and scaling in the cloud. What do you see, SASE providing to the business?
Yeah, so I'll take a kind of a different approach that I've seen more and more, and it comes with mergers and acquisitions, right? As we see customers start to, whether you're merging or you're acquiring, or even if you're divesting your company, there's different routes you can take that SASE vendors can help provide, whether adaptability, whether it's visibility into that company you're acquiring, and making sure that they adopt the solution that you're on, or divesting and you're breaking off, but that company still wants to keep keep SASE solution, or both companies, right? Being able to split that off easily into two different tenants. That is a huge benefit for a cloud native solution, to being able to quickly do that. Where legacy, right? If it was legacy data centers, there's a whole bunch to that. Being able to, sunset your data centers or your servers, move them over, right? Being able to then spin up new data centers if you're divesting, or acquiring new data centers and having to run through those and seeing what those servers are. When it comes to cloud native, you can quickly and easily do that in the span of weeks or months, and it makes it that much easier for M&As.
All right, and for our last topic question here, and before we go to that, just want to let you know, please feel free to add any questions you may have into the chat. We'll answer those at the end here. Starting again with Chris. With our support teams wearing more and more hats every day and continuously having less time, how does SASE simplify network and technology management, and what does that impact have on our daily operations?
Yeah, so major talking point, right? Tech rationalization, right? Being able to reduce your tech stack, whether it's from number of techs that you have, or it's reducing the cost, or both. You're able to simplify that down into, hey, now I can bring a SWIG solution into one, CASB solution into another, application control into that same one, right? Being able to cut it down in half or more greatly reduces that cost. And then it's management. Now I can have a smaller team manage one console or a couple of consoles, depending on the vendors. They're in one place, right? My DLP solution is in one place. That's in my CASB with my SWIG. Now management's easier. Being able to resolve tickets, that come in that are access issue tickets, easier to resolve instead of looking at several different places. All I have to do is look into one management plane. So your daily operational costs cut down a little bit. You're able to get probably more done. I've seen reduced number of tickets when companies start to implement a SASE solution compared to legacy solutions. And the list goes on.
Paul, go ahead and hand it over to you. Similar question, how does SASE simplify network and technology management, and what's the impact on daily operations?
Yeah, I think like we've all been talking about, having that one console to manage all of your policy stacks, not having to deploy it to specific locations, have that centralized location across SASE to look at, all of your policies, whether it's secure web gateways, ETNA, your DLP policies, the user behavior analytics, like I was talking about earlier, having all of that in one place, in one management console, to really be able to look at that. And then, that's where I think a lot of the APIs come in, because we have these SOC environments that are already heavily invested into SIM and SOAR platforms, and being able to send all of those logs and alerts to, potentially do auto remediation, auto policy creation back inside of your SASE solutions. And we're seeing some of the SASE vendors starting to build some of that capability in natively as well. So you're building in these analytics dashboards where I'm able to see a point in time to say, well, hey, who's using cloud storage today? Is there an opportunity to have more security efficacy across my policy stack, and without having to pull in telemetry from my firewall, from my on-prem web gateways, from my VPN solution, and trying to understand what identity is happening there for any policy perspective, being able to have that all in one space, to be able to review that and make more security controls, I think is a huge advantage to that. When you're doing SSL inspection at scale and you're looking at steering the majority of users' traffic, you're able to make more contextual decisions on potentially identifying gaps in your security program, on top of having more security efficacy from layering in what that maturity model looks like for the adoption of SASE.
All right. So now we're going to go ahead and switch over to a few questions that we received during the webinar. Starting with our first question, For organizations that are not ready to invest in a full SASE solution, where do you see them finding the most value with limited adoption? I guess I'll kind of open this up to either of you who wants to go first.
Yeah, I think where we're seeing the most is really starting on that security service edge side. So, we have the WAN edge services is more your network security controls, and then you have your security service edge is more your, actual security controls from that perspective. And when we look inside of that SSE stack, we see a lot of people starting with secure web gateway or ZTNA, like the VPN replacement. And potentially they're looking at BWAN to have an SD-WAN type of replacement, but those can be kind of treated separately. But I think when we see people starting with this SASE journey, they typically start with that secure web gateway or ZTNA, get the clients on the devices, get traffic steering, starting to layer in initial controls, work with your governance teams, your identity teams, and your risk teams to understand what requirements that you have, and then you can bring your security and your network teams together to really understand, back to what Chris was saying earlier around technology rationalization, to see like, well, what can this displace? Where can we have more adoption? And where can we focus more of our efforts towards, another buzzword, next gen type solution, to really get to that adoption there. So that's where I see the most.
So Chris, kind of based on that, what are some of the capabilities that Optiv provides from a maturity services perspective that can help clients through that journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So maturity services are great, whether it's adding on to other implementation services or standalone, right? We look kind of to enhance that product. So we look at how is it performing in your environment? What are your use cases? And then how can we, another buzzword, optimize your platform for you to really reach effective working capabilities specified to your environment, right? No client is the same. No environment is the same. If they were, I'd be out of a job. So it's really taking those maturity services and enhancing those platform capabilities, and also talking about other capabilities that might not be using. And as us experts, and for Paul being on the services side, he might identify a use case that they have that they don't have a capability for, and that's a perfect slot for maturity services of, hey, let's talk about this. Maybe we start going into a proof of concept with that vendor, and then we start to adopt it and implement it in maturity services, and we can extend that. And that's the benefit and kind of our white glove approach that separates us from other professional services orgs.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, where we're seeing a lot of adoption from our maturity services, we have clients saying, hey, I don't really understand what we need to do with DLP. We don't really have a lot of visibility into what we're doing. We don't really have governance teams that are guiding us on what we should even be looking for from a PII perspective. And we've come in with that maturity services approach to say, well, hey, let us help you with that maturity, help you build that your data protection strategy, and how that can apply not only in SASE but across some of your other tools. Maybe you're leveraging Microsoft and you're doing data classification and labeling. Well, we can look at that and say, well, how can we leverage that intelligence and any of that telemetry from some of those other DLP solutions to natively use that inside of SASE as well? So we're having a lot of really great outcomes based on our maturity services to be able to really help people enforce and build out foundational policies across DLP, and then getting them from that alert to coach to enforcement state, across their DLP environment for everything that's happening across SASE. So we're seeing a lot of really good benefits there.
You coined up a couple different things around really that convergence of data protection strategy and how it's affecting SASE. And it's really that sort of bridge that's starting to exist for everything that the legacy DLP data protection tools couldn't historically provide coverage. Kind of building on that, how are you seeing organizations integrate their data protection strategy with SASE?
A loaded question. I think they use it as kind of what Paul was saying, right? That kind of crawl, walk, run stage, right? First, some are using it as a monitoring state. Hey, well, what do I know, or what can I see that's being transferred, that's being moved? Is it PII, PCI, things like that? It then helps them identify what they need to really look for and implement DLP solutions for, but also shifting into, that data governance perspective and policies. Well, if I don't know what I'm looking for and I don't know what's in my environment, how can I identify what classification I should be putting on it? So it kind of goes both ways of then I'm saying, hey, I have PII in my environment. Now I'm going to shift into, now I can put labels around it, whether it's classified, unclassified, things like that, that help enhance your data governance program. And then go from there. And then you add in your DSPM capabilities that SASE solutions are starting to push more and more right now.
Yeah. And DSPM being the data security posture management. Thank you very much for that. So Chris and Paul, thank you for a wonderful discussion today on the core benefits and concepts of SASE. And thank you all for joining the Optiv webinar today. If you're ready to strategically think about this as part of your security strategy and stay future ready in an evolving threat landscape, please reach out to your sales representative today. Thank you.